All right, so we're going to continue our study of Galatians. I want to thank Nathan for filling in for me last week while I was out sick. We'll do some review this morning to get things going, and then we're going to be in Galatians chapter 4 when we get into the meat of our study this morning. So the title for our lesson today is The Gospel of Concern, and we'll dive into what that means a little bit more so as we get into our passages for today. But in terms of just some quick review, who wrote the book of Galatians? We'll start off very, very easy here. Who's the author? All right, so Paul the Apostle is the author of Galatians. He identifies himself there in Galatians chapter 1 at the very beginning in verse 1. And we said, I think the first day of class, that Galatians is most likely the first of the canonical epistles that Paul wrote. So of all of his writings, Romans, Ephesians, Philippians, the two letters to the Corinthians, etc., based on the timeline that we are assuming is pretty accurate, Galatians actually falls right there at the very beginning of his canonical epistles that are found here in Scriptures. And do you remember, we talked about this the first week of class, there were a couple of differences to how Paul starts out his writing to the Galatians. So you might remember one of those key differences between Galatians and Paul's other epistles that makes Galatians stand out somewhat? All right, so Paul has to defend his apostleship. So part of the first chapter of Galatians, Paul is actually defending his apostleship, and that seems to have been called into question by some of those who came into the churches there in Galatia. Galatians is also one of the most, I'm not sure what the word is exactly, but Paul is very, almost like angry when he writes this letter. He's very, very emotional when he writes this letter. And when Paul writes his other epistles, he always includes this prayer or these words of thanksgiving for the recipients. But that is noticeably missing from Galatians. Paul jumps right into the heart of the matter. He jumps right into the reason why he's writing the epistle, and he kind of skips over the prayer of thanksgiving that's very characteristic of his other epistles. And so that kind of sets Galatians apart in that regard. Now, this is a map here of kind of the Roman Empire. So where are the recipients of this letter? So in this map right here, where is Galatia? Where are the recipients for Paul's letter? I think I heard somebody say it. Yeah, Asia Minor. So the area there in modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, is kind of this Roman province of Galatia. Again, somewhat different. It's not written to a specific city, but rather to a collection of cities or churches in a general area. And think about Paul's missionary journeys. Think about his first missionary journey. Can you name some of the cities that likely were in this area of Galatia that Paul was writing to? Lystra, Derbe. All right, so Lystra, Derbe, Iconium. All right, those cities, I'll jump over here to this, maybe too small for you to see, but this is kind of outlining Paul's first missionary journey, and you can see there in the southern part of this region of Galatia, where those lines are connecting, those are likely to be the recipients of this letter. All right, the churches that Paul and Barnabas established in those cities in the southern area of Galatia, Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, Antioch of Pisidia, those areas are likely who Paul is writing to. Now, if you think about the timeline for the writing of Galatians, let's kind of keep things in perspective a little bit right here. So Paul has visited these cities on his first missionary journey, the one he took with Barnabas, and they visited these cities here in Galatia, as well as they made their way through the island of Cyprus as well. And likely after Paul completed that missionary journey, there were Judaizing Christians who came into these areas and began to tell the Gentile Christian converts that they had to do what? Be circumcised. They had to follow all of these Jewish laws. And Paul's reason for writing this epistle is to combat that. It's directly to make that correction. that no, in fact, if they do become circumcised or try to follow all these aspects of the Jewish law, they are actually reverting back to slavery. And he makes that point several times, that they have progressed in their faith. They are now part of the gospel, Christian dispensation, freedom, sonship. And if they are going to revert back to the Mosaic law and do some kind of melding of the two, they're actually making several steps backwards. They're reverting back to slavery. All right? Now, there's going to be an important thing that happens to Paul when he's in Lystra during that first missionary journey that we're going to come back and reference to later on when we get to the meat of our text today. All right? And can anybody think what that might be? What is something that happened, a very traumatic event that happened to Paul while he was in Lystra? Anybody remember? What happened to Paul in Lystra on his first missionary journey? He almost died. They thought that he had died, actually. Yes, Paul was stoned to the point that they thought he was dead. All right? Now, we're going to come back to that point in just a little while when we get to the meat of our text here. But keep that in mind that Paul is very, very memorable to these people, and they are very memorable to him because he was part of their conversion. But Paul almost died when he was right here in this area because of a stoning that took place while he was in Lystra specifically. All right, so here's our timeline. Our best guess is that Paul wrote this epistle following his first missionary journey and prior to the Jerusalem Council that's recorded in Acts chapter 15. So prior to his second and third missionary journeys, when he would revisit these cities, is most likely the time that he wrote this epistle, placing it, and based on this timeline at least, as the very first of his canonical writings. Okay, so the kind of way we're outlining Galatians is by looking at what are aspects of the gospel that we can glean or we can learn about from Paul's writing to the Galatians, and we'll kind of once again review our themes for each of our lessons. So when Paul starts out, what does he emphasize about the gospel in the first part of chapter 1? All right, chapter 1, there is one gospel, all right? There is one gospel that Paul reiterates to them. And what about in the latter part of chapter 1 when he has to defend his apostleship? The gospel is divine, all right? Paul received the gospel from Christ. It was not from man. The gospel is divine. The gospel that converted him on the road to Damascus came straight from Christ. It is a divine gospel. In chapter 2, we read about the gospel being for whom? The gospel is for all. Jew, Gentile, male, female, slave, free, it does not matter. The gospel is for all. All right? And then Paul gets into this discussion between faith and works. And he contrasts the gospel, which is of faith, to the old Mosaic law, which was of works. So the gospel is not a gospel of works. That was characteristic of the old law of Moses. The gospel instead is a gospel of faith. All right? Now, when we get into lesson 5, the first part of Galatians chapter 3, Paul begins his appeals to the Galatians, all right, appealing to them about why the gospel is so much better than the old law of Moses. All right, and one of his arguments is that the gospel was what? What did the old law say about the gospel? Yeah, it was prophesied. It was foretold. The gospel is foretold. All right? When God spoke to Abraham, when the law and the prophets wrote and spoke, they were telegraphing to the people that this was a temporary thing. The law of Moses was not designed to be forever. It was temporary. All right? And in so doing, they were telling the people that there's going to be something coming later on that's going to be better, all right? And then that gets us to then lesson number 6. The gospel was the what of the law? The fulfillment. The gospel was the fulfillment of the law. The law prophesied it was coming, and when the gospel came, when Christ was born, when he died, when he was buried and resurrected, that was the fulfillment of the law. And then last week, when I was out, Nathan talked to you about sonship and inheritance. And my title or theme for that aspect of the gospel is, it is a gospel of equal inheritance. Slave, free, male, female. Paul writes that the gospel is for all, and we all have an equal inheritance. We are all equal sons together for that inheritance, for that blessing through the gospel. And that takes us then through the first part of chapter 4, where we'll then pick up in verse 8 this morning. All right, any questions or comments so far? All right, so as we kind of move up to where we're at right now, Paul has been going through his appeals. He's been talking to them and making these justifications or these reasons why the gospel is superior to the law of Moses and why they should not try to revert back to these laws of the Old Testament. All right, his first appeal is one of the personal experience of them. He gives those 5 rhetorical questions meant to kind of jog their minds and remind them of when they first became Christians, what they were giving up to become Christians. And then he moves on into 2 arguments from the Old Testament. One is from Abraham, and one is from the law and the prophets. Paul tells them and reminds them that Abraham was justified by what? Was it by works? Abraham was justified by faith, and that was a prophecy or foretelling about what would happen later on. And then also in the writings of both the law and the prophets, he tells the Galatians the path to salvation, it was foretold by your own prophets and by the writings of Moses himself that this was going to be coming. And then his third argument we mentioned just a minute ago with the law was temporary. It was never designed to last forever. The law was always intended to be a temporary law to get them to now. He says the law was our guardian. The law was our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. It was a temporary guardianship of the people, of the Jews. And then last week, as Nathan told us, then they have moved from slavery to sonship. Right? Why would you want to go back to slavery when you are now sons, when you can now have that inheritance? And that brings us then to verse 8, where we're going to pick up today. So he's just gone through one of his appeals. And this appeal is, you've gone from slavery to sonship. You've gone from slavery with no inheritance, no prospects for the future or eternity, to inheritance. Now you are sons of God, equal partners to the inheritance, to the blessings of heaven. And so he takes a little break within these appeals or these arguments that he makes, and he kind of makes an appeal to them just based upon his own love and concern for the people. All right? And so that's why we get to our title for the lesson today, which is a gospel of concern. All right, we're going to outline this next section of chapter 4 with 3 concerns that Paul expresses for the people. He's going to make an appeal to them of his own love and concern for them. And that's going to be his next appeal, is the fact that he has a deep love for these people. So let's read verses 8 through 11 of chapter 4. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not gods. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? Question mark. You observe days and months and seasons and years. I'm afraid I may have labored over you in vain. So the first concern he has for them is that they want to go back to the state of slavery. All right? He's just told them in his previous appeal that you've progressed out of slavery into sonship. You've left your old ways of doing things, which for the Jews was the Mosaical law. For the Gentiles, it was paganism. And he says right here, formerly when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not gods. What's he referring to there? How are they enslaved to those that by nature are not gods?
Was he referring to the pagan gods?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so look back over to, let's read a little bit about his first missionary journey, all right? Go back over to Acts chapter 14. So in Acts 14, he is right there in this area of Galatia. And this is right before he gets stoned. But if you start reading in verse 8 of Acts 14, we had this story where Paul and Barnabas encounter a man who is crippled from birth. And in verse 10, says with a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. So Paul heals a man who's been crippled from birth. Now, beginning in verse 11 and kind of moving forward, what do the people begin to call Paul and Barnabas? Zeus, Hermes. They're referring to them as these Roman or these Greek gods, part of the Roman or Greek pantheon. All right? All these Roman gods. The people here in Galatia, that's their religion. Their religion is that Roman or Greek pantheon of gods. And they are attributing this power that Paul's displayed to those gods, to Zeus and to Hermes. And how do Paul and Barnabas react when they are called Zeus and Hermes? He says in verse 15, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you." And then he says, "We bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them." A living God. We're just men, but we're telling you about a living God who is very different from Zeus. How is Jehovah God different from Zeus? Well, he says right here in Galatians that are not gods. That Zeus isn't even a god. He's not even a thing. He's just a figment of your imagination. He is not a living God. He is a dead, never was alive God. And Paul is saying right here, when you did not know the true God, the living God Jehovah, before I preached him to you, you were enslaved to that Roman pantheon of gods. You were enslaved to that old religion. But in verse 9, back in Galatians 4, now that you've come to know the one true God, or at least rather God knows you, all right? So both ways. You now know God and the true God knows you as well. Why in the world would you want to turn back to that weak and worthless elementary principles of the world back into slavery? This is Paul's concern for them. Why in the world do you want to go back to where you were before, to that pagan lifestyle? That's Paul's concern. I did all this. I preached the gospel to you. I demonstrated his power when I healed the crippled man and did other miracles through God's power. Why would you want to go back into this situation of slavery, being enslaved to these pagan gods? Now, in verse 10, he's referring to something a little bit different. In verse 10, he says, you observe days and months and seasons and years. And then he says, I'm afraid my work may have been in vain. So at first, he's referring to their old pagan religion. But what's he referring to now? This is sort of a metaphor, if you will. But these days and months and years and seasons, what's it a metaphor for?
The Jewish feasts and celebrations.
Exactly. So this is what's happened. You've got these Greeks, these Galatians, who were pagans. Their religion was that Roman pantheon. Paul and Barnabas came in, they preached the gospel to them, and they converted over to Christianity. They left slavery, and they came to sonship. But now we've got these Judaizing Christians who have come in and have gotten them to switch to this third religion, the Jewish religion, the old law. And Paul is saying that you were slaves to paganism. Well, the Jewish law right now is also slavery. So whether you go back to paganism or you take on this law of Moses, which is done, it's been fulfilled, it's been put away by Christ, reverting to that is just as bad as going back into paganism. Both Paul equates to slavery. And he says, all of our work, Paul and Barnabas, all that we did, I'm worried that it was in vain for you to go back into a state of slavery, reverting to those old habits. All right? Now, let's start reading in verse 12, okay? Brothers, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You did me no wrong. You know it was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first. And though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. What then has become of the blessing you felt? For I testify to you that if possible, you would have gouged out your own eyes and given them to me. Have I then become your enemy by telling you the truth? Paul's next concern for these people is that not only are they reverting back to slavery, they're trying to give away the blessings that came with their conversion to Christianity. Now, Paul speaks in this section of Scripture right here about when he was there in this area during his first missionary journey. He apparently had some kind of significant ailment, and that caused him to spend a little extra time with the people here in Galatians. And he probably was somewhat of a burden on them. They were taking care of him physically with his ailment while he was using that time to preach the gospel to them. And he's very complimentary of them right here in this section of Scriptures. He says in verse 13, you know that it was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you. I came to you and I spent time with you because I was sick. And though my condition was a trial to you, I was somewhat of a burden on you. You had to take care of me during this time. You didn't scorn or despise me. You weren't mad about it. You were happy to help take care of me. You loved me as much as I loved you. You took care of me physically while I was sick, and I was taking care of you spiritually by preaching the gospel to you. So he's making an appeal right here about this mutual love they had for each other while he was there in this area during his first missionary journey. They helped take care of him while he was sick, and he took that chance to then preach to them and take care of their spiritual needs. Now, you could ask the question, okay, well, what was it that he was sick with? Well, two possibilities here I want to bring up as food for thought. Okay, the first one is Paul's thorn in the flesh. All right, turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Now, we don't know what Paul's thorn in the flesh was, all right? There's lots of debate about what it could have been, but the honest truth is we don't really know. But we do know from 2 Corinthians 12, beginning in verse 7, that he had something going on. He says in 2 Corinthians 12, beginning in verse 7, "So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So, we don't know what it was that Paul had. Some kind of chronic illness, some kind of physical ailment. Probably it was a long-lasting illness or injury that he had sustained. All right. But I also want you to think about another possibility, and the two actually could be the same. Go back to Acts 14. We saw in Acts 14 just a moment ago, Paul and Barnabas were in Lystra. They healed the crippled man. They were referred to as Zeus and as Hermes. After that series of events, in verse 19, "But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, 2 other cities in this area of Galatia, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe." Now, Paul is stoned to the point that they're pretty sure he's dead. And they drag him out of the city, and they leave him for dead. Do you think that it took him a little while to recover from being stoned to the point of almost death? Probably yes. So, when I read this in Galatians about Paul being in this area for an extended time, having this ailment, having to be taken care of by the people, this seems like a pretty likely reason why you would have to stick around in this area for a while. Because if you've been stoned to the point that they think you're dead and they leave you for dead, it's going to take a little while before you're back up to feeling to where you can travel long distances and continue on this missionary journey. All right? So whether his ailment that kept him there was this thorn in the flesh, this chronic illness he suffered, or whether it was being stoned and just having to physically recover from that traumatic event, or if the stoning and somehow led to the thorn in the flesh, which is another possibility, something happened right here that delayed Paul, and he stuck around. And the time that he...
Do you think it could have been his vision, since he mentions you would have poked your eyes out and got into the vision?
I think that's a real good possibility. So, yeah, you're right. He says there in verse, let's see, where is it? Verse 15, "I testify to you that if possible, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me." So imagine being pelted with stones, and those stones hit you in the face. Your face is bloody, your eyes are bloody, maybe you've partially gone blind, or in the very least, you've got major injuries to your eyes. That is certainly a possibility. So it's hard to know for sure if he's speaking about this as like a metaphor, right? You would have given me your own eyes, or if this is more literal. Like, I couldn't see anything, but you loved me enough, you would have given me your eyes because mine had been injured so much. All right? The sight seems like a pretty likely possibility. This seems a little bit more literal. I mean, it's still figurative. They wouldn't actually give their eyes to him, but this seems more literal in terms of the actual injury may have been his eyesight. And you can imagine how stoning could certainly explain why that would happen. But his appeal to them is, you were there for me, and I was there for you. We were there for one another. That love is what he's appealing to right now. All right? And then he says right there in verse 15, the first part of 15, what then has become of the blessing you felt? So they were pagans. They spent time with Paul and Barnabas. They got to know them closely. They took care of Paul after these injuries. And Paul says, are you going to give up those blessings? What blessings come with that? What blessings would they have been giving up that Paul didn't want them to give up? What blessings do you have? Say again? Salvation, right? Certainly a blessing is, hey, I'm saved. My sins are washed away. What other blessings do you have that Paul wanted for these people? They've got freedom. They're no longer slaves. They are free. What else? Love. Brotherly love for Paul, for one another. Right? The list could go on, right? We have a brotherhood together. We have salvation. We have freedom. We have an inheritance. We have heaven waiting on us. The same, go ahead. We have forgiveness. Those blessings that Paul didn't want them to give up are the same blessings that we have right now that Paul doesn't want us to give up. All right? He does not want them to revert to slavery, and he does not want them to give up these blessings that have come with their redemption, with their conversion, the blessings that the gospel brought to them, the blessings the gospel has brought to us, are what Paul doesn't want them to give up. All right. Third thing is he's concerned that they are not growing in their faith. All right, let's finish up this section of Scripture. We will start in verse 17 and read through 20. They make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out that you may make much of them. It is always good to be made much of for a good purpose, and not only when I am present with you, my little children, for whom I am again in the anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. I wish I could be present with you now and change my tone, for I am perplexed. I'm confused about you. All right. So he says in verse 17, they make much of you. They want to shut you out that you'll make much of them. So this phrase, make much of, it's flattery, right? They are flattering you because they want you to flatter them. All right? They want you to lift them up on a pedestal, and they are lifting you up on a pedestal. They're trying to flatter you. Who is they? Who's Paul referring to right here?
The Judaizing teachers.
Exactly. These people that have come in and are causing discord in these churches. The Judaizing Christians are flattering these Gentile converts, saying all these things to get them to convert, or to get them at least to take on these Judaizing principles and blend them into Christianity. And Paul says it's great to be flattered, all right, but not for this reason. Not for the reason of they just want to get something out of this. They're in it for themselves, right? They want you to flatter them so they'll feel good about themselves, and they want to take these Jewish laws that are part of their history, and they want to hang on to them, and they want to force them on you as well, even though you're Gentiles and not Jews in the first place. All right? And then he says in verse 19, little children. So he's referring to these Gentiles as youths, not adults, not mature Christians. He's referring to them as little children or youths. In Hebrews chapter 5, it's been really nice this quarter to be studying Hebrews on Wednesday night because I'm seeing all these parallels as we go through the book of Hebrews on Wednesday to what we're doing here on Sunday morning. But in Hebrews chapter 5, we have a very similar situation going on where the Christians are not maturing in their faith as they should be. Hebrews 5, beginning in verse 12. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food, for everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he is a child. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. When I read Paul writing right here, calling the Galatians little children, that's what comes to my mind. All right? They should have matured past this ability to be influenced so easily. But they haven't matured in their faith. And they are easily influenced by these Judaizing Christians. And he says, for whom I again, in the anguish of childbirth, until Christ is formed in you. He is in anguish over them because he loves them. He wants them to grow in their independence, in their independent faith. He doesn't want to have to come back constantly and feed them more milk. He wants them to change their diet over to meat, to be at a point where they can teach themselves and not be swayed so easily by any little thing that might come in and influence them too easily. Okay, so in our last few minutes right here, let's talk about this gospel of concern. Paul had a deep love for these people, in part because they took care of him when he was apparently very, very sick. But even more so, Paul had a deep love and concern for them because they were lost. And he and Barnabas were there on the front lines preaching the gospel to them when they became Christians. When you are involved with teaching someone, with converting someone, that builds a very, very tight relationship. So think about all the people you've encountered, people that you may have influenced in their path to Christianity. Think about that relationship that you have with them that was built, that may have been strengthened through those interactions. That's the relationship Paul felt for these people. They were his brethren. They were his children almost. He was right there with them with this conversion. That is the concern, that is the love that the gospel brings. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that the gospel. The gospel is the death, the burial, the resurrection of Christ, the good news. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God so loved the world that he made the gospel happen. That's the concern God has for us, and that's the concern that God expects us to have for everybody outside of these walls that's lost. And that's a tall request. Paul felt it for these people. He had a deep concern for them, just as God does for them. But we are called as well to have the same concern for everybody outside of this building. We're called to have that same concern for everybody else, that we are willing to go out and bring them the gospel, just as Paul and Barnabas brought the gospel to these people here in Galatia. Questions or comments? All right, so the gospel itself is the death, the burial, the resurrection of Christ. The gospel is the good news that those events led to our freedom, have led to our sonship. But the whole impetus for the gospel is love. The whole reason for the gospel is the concern that God has for us, mankind. And God wants us to have that same level of concern and love for the lost. And that's why we're called to be evangelists. That's why we're called to go out and to preach the gospel, because it is the good news. We have freedom, we have sonship, and God wants us to spread that sonship to everyone else. All right, thank you for your attention. I will see you all again next week.